All right. So welcome everybody. This is Space to Grow, Assessing Future Library Building Needs. My name is Kelly Nelson. I am the coordinator of library development at the Bridges Library System and the coordinator for continuing ed for the Southeastern Wisconsin libraries. And joining me today is Deb Haeffner from the South Central Library System, Teresa Schmidt from the Wisconsin DPI Bureau of Libraries, and John Thompson from the IFLS Library System. We are part of the Wisconsin Library Buildings and Spaces Project, which is a project that was developed in the last couple of years to fill a need for libraries who are looking for resources on buildings, expansions, all things related to buildings. We do have a webpage that has previous webinars as well as other resources. I'll drop that link in the chat in a moment. But just a couple of things as people are speaking. If you have a question for them, feel free to throw that in the Q&A box and we'll try to address them. We have 3 speakers today, and so we'll try to address those questions as each speaker finishes up. And then we'll have a larger Q&A discussion at the end if it's a broader question that maybe did not get addressed within the webinar. So with that, we'll start things off with Teresa.
Thank you, Kelly. Do you want to go ahead and advance the
Yeah,
slides?
if I can get this to do what I want. There we go.
There we go. So Kelly told you about the 3 of us that are presenting today. I'm going to start this presentation with a little bit of background information about the space planning outline. Public Library Space Needs, a Planning Outline is the official name of that document. And then Deb and John are going to follow up with some examples, real life examples from libraries in Wisconsin that are using the space planning outline for some of their planning needs. So go ahead and advance the slide, Kelly. And I'm going to turn my video off just so I can focus on my content for this part of the presentation, and I'll pop it back on when we have questions or when you want to talk to me more personally. So the Public Library Space Needs Planning Outline was first developed in the late 1980s, early 1990s. It is a publication of the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. It was developed because until that time, public libraries were using sort of an outdated X square feet per capita measure of how much space they thought they might need for a library in the future. It wasn't a very good measure. It was better than nothing, but it was an oversimplification, and it did not take into account the varying amount of support libraries receive from their communities, the unique local factors that go into library service, the economies of scale for large versus small libraries, and things like that. So the basic concept of this outline, both the original that was first developed way back then in the early 1990s and its subsequent editions, including the latest one that was just released this summer, is that by identifying your library's service goals, you can predict the amount of space that you're going to need to fill those goals. So the purpose of the outline is not to help you come up with a final plan for your library. It is really there to help you evaluate whether or not you even need to be talking about a building project. It's designed to help you sort of sell your project to the library board, your community, your elected officials. It's designed to give you some backup and some basic data for planning to help you estimate, is my library going to be adequate to fill my community's needs now, in 10 years from now, 20 years from now, whatever your timeline is? This guide is not good at helping you decide whether you need to renovate or build a new space. It does address it a little bit, but that's going to be a decision based on so many unique factors about your building and your space that it's hard to address in a statewide guide like this. It's also not very good at determining sort of rates of return on efficiency projects, HVAC improvements, renewable energy projects, and things like that. It's also not very good at understanding or predicting changes in your community. You're going to have to do some of that background work to sort of estimate where your community is going in terms of demographics, economic trends, and things like that that might affect your service goals in the future. So these are things that you're going to need different types of planning for: strategic planning, energy assessments, etc. That's not what this space planning outline is about. However, this guide really is a good basic starting point when you are talking about whether or not your community needs an improved or new library space. So the role of the Bureau of Libraries, this is, as I said, a DPI publication. It was first written by Anders Dahlgren, and he has revised all of the editions, including this current one. My job when I arrived at this position a year ago was the outline had already been revised and rewritten. I am just launching it into the world, so I can't really claim any credit for it. However, the people in this room, Deb and John, and many others in Wisconsin who participate in the Buildings and Spaces project, did have some input into it. They helped Anders by reading earlier versions of the guide and providing some suggestions for improvement. So this has been a collaborative project by many people in Wisconsin. I want to just state right off the bat, nothing in this outline is required of public libraries. This is not connected to standards. It's not connected to any of the work that DPI does in determining your compliance as a library. This is only for you to use as a planning tool, for you and your funding agencies and your library board to better understand your needs in the future. So looking at the guide itself, there are 9 main steps in completing the outline, and each step is described in the narrative document. So it provides information on how you're going to make decisions related to your potential future library and its space needs for each section of the outline, which includes collection space, technology space, reader seating, staff workspace, meeting rooms, special use spaces, non-assignable space like elevator shafts and things like that, and then dedicated allowances for special projects or services that your library offers, such as a makerspace or a computer lab or things like that. The guide is accompanied by a spreadsheet, and that's what you're seeing sort of screenshots of here. You're going to see this in more detail when Deb and John get into the examples in a couple minutes. This is an Excel file that accompanies the outline. You can download it from our Bureau of Libraries website. The Excel file is fairly locked down, but it's not password protected. So if you need to make changes to it, you can go to the Review tab in Excel and click the Unprotect Sheet option, and then you'll have full ability to edit the whole thing. It's designed, though, the way it is now to be pretty simple to use. You're going to plug in all of the data that you are gathering by going through that outline document into the Space Needs worksheet, and then it is going to spit it out on a Space Needs summary that's sort of designed for you to print and share with your library board and your funding agency and your local elected officials. The outline and spreadsheet try to ease your work by automatically building in as many logical allocations as possible. So for example, when it's determining collection space, it allows you to select your preferred shelving height and aisle space. You don't have to know in your head how many books per square foot you can fit in. The outline is doing that work for you. It's similar for a preferred density for audiovisual items. If you want to have more space to showcase and market your items, you might want a more generous allowance. For meeting rooms, it'll automatically add things like space for the speaker, meeting room storage, extra space in the story time room if you typically do craft activities and things like that. So the spreadsheet tries to take a lot of that calculation work away from you and allow you to just focus on what your priorities are in terms of service. So I want to just talk briefly about connecting the guide to the standards. Wisconsin Public Library standards are once again not a mandatory item. They are used as a planning tool. They're used by us here at DPI when we are evaluating new library proposals or joint library proposals to determine what a service need level might be appropriate for a community, but they are not tied to funding. They're not tied to your system membership. They're just a planning tool. That said, the outline does use the standards in helping you determine some of the things that your library may need. For example, if you're doing a population projection 20 years out, you may not know how many books are you going to need to serve that population in 20 years, how many audiovisual items, how many computer workstations. So those are the kinds of things that the outline relies on the standards to help you determine. I want to point out that we are currently starting a project to review and revise Wisconsin Public Library standards. So about a year from now, we hope you will have some new standards to look at. The current ones are getting fairly dated. There's some things in there that may not be relevant to your library. So again, you're going to pick and choose what makes sense when you're choosing some of these data points for your library service area. Just because the standard says you need 10 magazine subscriptions per 1,000 residents does not mean that you actually need those anymore, right? You know your library and your community best. So feel free to go through all of these things with your own library's needs in mind and choose what makes the most sense. The outline also provides some alternative ways of looking some of this information. So on collection sizes, it talks about the standards level, but it also talks you through the process of sort of evaluating your current collection, your current rate of additions and withdrawals from that collection, and making some determinations into the future. So there, if you read through the whole outline document, it does have a lot of information on how to make some of these decisions. Another thing I want to talk about briefly is service population. We get a lot of questions about this because there is a service population number on your annual report, and that number is calculated by us at DPI. And the outline, the space planning outline, talks specifically about determining your service population, and it doesn't use that number from your annual report at all. And that's rightfully so, because that number does not really connect to reality. That number talks about assigning all of the residents in Wisconsin to a library in some way, and it uses your municipal resident populations, your populations of people who live in a community without libraries. It looks at boundaries based on counties, not based on actual traffic patterns. So there's all kinds of reasons why that number may not be relevant, but the outline does address how to look at what your current figures are, what your current ratios between resident and non-resident borrowing are, and how you might use some of that data to project a population into the future using things like the Wisconsin Department of Administration's demographic projections that you can download from their website. So there is some discussion in the outline about how you can go about making an educated guess about what your community is going to look like over your planning period. You're not going to be doing a building project just to serve people next year. Most building projects are looking 20 or more years into the future. So you do want to spend some time looking at your service population. And then one last thing before I turn this over to John and Deb for some examples, just a few caveats. Step 10 of the outline talks about developing a building statement, because completing this outline is just going to give you a square footage number. It's going to give you a ballpark that you're going to aim for in terms of raising money for your new library construction, evaluating your current space as opposed to your needs in the future, and so on. It is only meant as an initial assessment to help you decide whether and how to proceed. If you're in the stage of asking questions like, do we need a bigger library? Or how can we convince the community that we need a bigger library? That is the ideal place to use the outline. But you will need a professional planner and architect to develop any estimates from this outline into a building statement and an actual plan in the future. So don't expect that this space planning outline is going to be the end answer to all of your planning needs. And finally, the outline addresses this in a couple of points, but don't skimp on yourself at this point in the planning process. You're going to be faced with pressures, financial and economic and, just physical space pressures to downsize your project as you go all along the way. If you start with too stingy an estimate on your space needs, when it keeps getting pared back over that whole planning process, you may end up with something less than what would be ideal for your community. So the outline is intentionally generous in its space estimates. Be aware of that, but also don't discount it because of that. That can be a useful starting point for your discussions, even if the end result ends up at some other number. So that's kind of my background on what the outline is, where it came from, and how you might look at using it. So now I'm going to turn it over. I think Deb is up first with an example, or is it John? I don't remember.
It's
It
Deb.
is, it is
Okay.
Deb. I have no questions thus far, so you can go ahead and take it away, Deb.
All right, thank you. All right, so my example is going to be spacing, getting the space assessment for an addition on an existing library. It's a beautiful Carnegie Library. It was built in about 1912, is 6,200 square feet. It's 2 stories. It's ideally located in the downtown. It's like across the street from City Hall, a block from the community center and rec office, just a couple blocks from the elementary, middle school, charter school. It's with walking and biking distance for a majority of the community. So, the ideal for them would be if they could do an addition versus, a new location. However, this assessment will allow for giving us the square footage that we would be looking at for whatever situation may, come down the road when this would maybe happen. So in about 1990, there was a renovation to the existing building where they did add an ADA accessible access entrance and an elevator. So that was the first step to make this building, function. They also have been pretty, cognizant of the need of if they were going to be downtown and stay there, they have to start acquiring property. So they had acquired the house next door several years ago, probably 30 years ago. That was moved, and that was going to be the future addition. They then, maybe about 10 years ago, ended up turning that into a parking lot. Still can be an addition, and the city and the library board purchased the house on the corner, which at some point, ideally, hopefully will move, but time will tell what happens with that. But currently, it is the library annex, and the Friends bookstore is in like the dining room area. There's literacy tutoring that happens in the sunroom, and the small kind of living room, sunroom area has extra space for programs, book discussion groups, maybe, board meetings if we need to, small business meetings for people if they can't get another space in the city. And then actually the second floor is currently being rented out to local artists. So there's very minimal income, but there is, some income coming in. About 20 years ago, they did try to plan out for an addition. They hired an architect, they did an addition, and they started looking for what is the feasibility for funding that addition. And at that point, they really didn't find any community support, and they were trying really hard not to have to go to referendum and put that burden on the public. So they ended up just kind of stepping away from it and saying, we're going to have to wait. So there's been renewed interest from the city as well as the library board. We've done a current strategic plan, and there's just been questions, what would we need if we were going to do, an addition at some point? So this assessment, we kind of focused on the municipal population, and the projected to 2050 comes out to 5,484 people. And at this point, we're not looking necessarily at the service population, but I did do a peer library size, comparison across the state. And we were obviously at least a third of what most communities had. It was anywhere from 15 to like 27, 30,000 square feet. So we were in that kind of realm of what we were thinking we were going to need. So our space assumptions there were three kind of major areas. The first one was collection. We have an okay collection, but it's a real fresh collection because it has to be weeded pretty much all the time if you want to add new items to any of the collections. So that's the first thing. If we want to look at growth of certain collections, which most libraries do, there's the large print collection, the picture books, fiction, teen, all of those areas, we don't have room to expand. The collections at this point are the books, the shelving has been shifted as many ways as you can possibly shift it to make it fit and make usable space. There are no more options. So at this point, they were looking at a desired print collection of about 36,000 and an AV collection of approximately 5,000. Now I had printed off the current collection with the percentage checked out, and I asked the staff to go through every line and decide what percentage they would like to see it grow, or if it's not going to grow, or if it's going to go away. And then I did calculations off of that to get our total number, but then I further went on to decide the square footage needed because I calculated the different shelving heights, the percentages that they needed to have on them, all of that, and then kind of compared that to the spreadsheet. I was going back and forth between the two of them. I would enter the information and then I'd also double check it against my numbers, and they always came out pretty much identical. So the spreadsheet is pretty good at doing, what you need it to do, and you can pretty much rely on those numbers as being fairly realistic. So aside from just adding the collection, the desire was to get wider aisles because we're at like 36, and lower shelving and more consistent shelving because we have some new, but a lot of it's, wood shelving that's been hand built years ago, and it varies in depth and quality, and it's, starting to get a little bowed and all of that. So, upgrading that would be ideal. And not using the bottom shelves, of course. And then just to get a feeling of more open space because it's very, very crowded. The next area that we were, have to consider is the computer and technology space. Now, we weren't really going to increase that too much. We're adding a few more computers and some packs, or OPACs, but other than that, the usage has gone down. Like a lot of libraries, it's not as high as it is. And ideally, we will have more seating options for people to use their own devices, check out computer laptops, whatever. There'll be more options within the library than there are right now. So adding more seating is going to help that immensely. And then the next area would be ample patron seating, and that's a variety of options in different spaces. Right now, the library has 6 lounge seats in the adult area, like 2 in the teen area, which are right next to the fireplace and the adult seating, and then like 1 love seat and a table in the children's area in the basement. There's just no quiet areas. There's no place to just get away and study. Everybody's on top of each other. So we really are looking to have a lot of, options for seating, for different heights, for different people, for different uses, little cubby spaces to be, all of that above and beyond study rooms. And really, we want to increase it to like 70 some seats, although if you look at the guide, it's for our population, it ends up being around 54, 55 seats. But again, that's kind of a choice that you have to make when you're going through it. And there's reasons behind what my number I came up with, and I'll talk about in the end of the slide. So the other really critical space for this library is increasing staff office and workspace areas. Currently, the director does have an office, but unfortunately it has to be shared with the adult services librarian. So at one point there was a table and chairs in there so she could meet with, vendors, patrons, staff, whoever. But now that she has a shared office, you really cannot meet in there. If you want to meet with her, even if the other librarian's not in there, it's not conducive to having a conversation because her computer screen is in the way. So you're meeting in the meeting room downstairs if it's open, or at the annex or some other location because there just isn't a private space. And her office is the one on the left in the images on screen. On the right is, this is the staff workroom. It's behind the cert desk. There's one desk there. It's basically a storage space. There's really no prep area that you can't do really any kind of mending or any kind of ILL, nothing. All that happens at the cert desk. So that is definitely an area that needs to be addressed. And then the children's office in the basement is basically the same size as the director's. But again, that's shared with the marketing person and is a storage space. So not adequate for any kind of meetings for anyone. I mean, either together or with another person, or to bring in vendors or programming. If you're trying to contact a performer and book anything, you're just, there's never any privacy. So those areas definitely need to be addressed. And there's also no staff break room at all. If they want to eat, they have to either eat in this little back work area or they eat in the small meeting room downstairs, where there's glass doors so everyone can see them while they're eating and they kind of wave as they go by. So not great. So that's the other area that really needs to be addressed for them to really have a functioning space where staff can, do their job, concentrate on their duties, and, not have to deal with the public 100% of the time when they're at work. And other area that most every library is dealing with right now is the desire for additional meeting and programming spaces. Their current space holds about 40 people. And the annex, you can get maybe 15 people in there. 20 is really pushing it. Larger programs are held on the library lawn in good weather, or at the community center down the street, or the rec center building for like a large book discussion group. They've often had to hold large programs where the presenter is on the first level in front of the fireplace, and then in the lower level, they do a virtual screening of that presenter on the floor above them because they really have no other option. So ideally for them, they would love a large community room with a kitchenette and storage. It would be accessible after hours. They would love to have a separate story time room with storage because again, they're all sharing this small meeting room. They've had to put in storage on the side to accommodate keeping the space at least neat and clean for other meetings to come in. They'd love a maker space or some sort of flex meeting space, a conference room, and they would like to add at least 4 study rooms. And finally, they would like to have some special use spaces, which would be a friend sale space for storage and sales, because currently it's in the annex, and if that were to go away, they need a place to be. They would like to have a mother's/sensory room. It would be nice to have a local history area because local history around here is very big. And then add restrooms because they only have 2 single stall restrooms in the lower level at this point. So I went through and as I was working on this, I was plugging this information into this spreadsheet. And when they had hired the architect several years ago, I had access to those plans. And they were pretty close to the size that we were actually projecting because we were using space differently than was planned for over 20 years ago. It was almost half of the first floor was like computer tech space, which is not where things are going right now. So I kind of reallocated the spaces on the plan to fit all of these different spaces that we were looking at. And I, plugged those numbers into this spreadsheet. And I had the luxury of being able to, measure stairways and elevator cores and HVAC because a lot of that was already on the plan. And I could then make sure that all of the shelving that I needed fit into the plan and, where I could actually tuck extra chairs and tables, which kind of gave me this number. So I ended up plugging all of those space needs into this worksheet, all the items that we had looked at, the collection, all of that. And when I calculated what I had come up with individually for all of these things and what the space needs projected, it was like 100 square feet off. So, this is pretty reliable, as Teresa said. It gives you that extra, kind of space that you need. It lets you say, yeah, we need 100 square feet, but maybe it's going to be 120 based on this, just because they allow that. So if you want to go to the next slide. So this is just my altering the plan that they had from like 20 some years ago. I adjusted the space, I bumped things out, I added rooms. So the bottom portion that's a little lighter is the existing building. And then this is with the addition with my changes, kind of allocating that space because, the city kind of wanted to know, this is not the final plan, this is not what's happening, but what would we get out of doing this? So this is how I kind of went about it and illustrated, this is how the space can be used. If we're moving forward, people can kind of get an idea, this is what we need. It may not be this building, it may not be this configuration, but this is what we can get. So that's what I have.
Thank you, Deb. We don't have any questions, so John, we'll move on.
Thanks, Kelly. So my case study is going to start a little bit in the infancy of their project stage. So this is an example of how they used it to convince their village board to increase their space. So the village of Centuria is part of a 3 community school districts. So there is no public school building located within the village. Their library is located in a downtown storefront. Their downtown district is like many small communities that sit on a highway. Everything is kind of moved towards the highway, and downtown has seen its share of disrepair or vacant buildings or unique stores or unique businesses that move in that maybe don't have as much foot traffic as some other vibrant downtown. So the library was looking at, do we need more space? How can we convince our community that we need a new library? Our community is relatively poor. We have few businesses to help support our property tax base. We are not seeing an influx of population into our community. So we're really looking at a community that's relatively stagnant, but it does sit along a highway. The library is a couple of blocks away, that has had some growth on it. That particular corridor has new businesses coming in, and it intersects a couple of different state highways. So there is traffic. It's a matter of whether they're going to stay and live in the village. So as we looked at it, their projected population 20 years out really didn't grow that significantly. So we then started focusing on what the library wanted to do. So we were looking at the space assumptions. So if you want to grab the next slide, Kelly. Again, they're looking at wider aisles. Their ceiling is relatively low. The shelving is tall, so they want wider aisles, lower shelves, and feeling much more open. They have a decent sized collection for their library, but it's all compacted onto shelves. Everything is maxed out. They really want to create that space to invite people in. If we then look at their computer and technology space, their patron seating and the staff areas, if you want to grab the next slide, Kelly, their workspace for their 2-person staff is right inside the front door. There's a desk for the director. There's a desk for the assistant. It's their circulation desk. It's their processing space. It's their programming storage space. It's all of their records. It's kind of their lunch break room. So they were really looking at trying to figure out what we would need to serve the library. They still have a pretty decent computer usage by the community. Not everybody there can afford high-speed internet. They don't necessarily have access to printers. There is also a seasonal population that comes in. They're located adjacent to a state bike trail, and they get folks coming to use that trail. They get some remote workers that are vacationing in the area. But everything is pretty tucked in. The building right now, it's 1,400 square feet. So it's pretty small. It used to be a bakery and was repurposed as a library. So the building's been there at least 60 years. So it's not really a brand new building. The director obviously would like an office space. If you want to flip to the next slide, Kelly, they'd like to have an area for story time, some early literacy activity spaces, more seating, a kitchenette, some space for community groups, senior meals, elections. There is not a large community space in this particular village. The village hall is outdated. It has a meeting space, but it's right next to where the village clerk sat. So you cannot really have a meeting while they're conducting village business, in terms of people paying their bills. So there, was a thought, well, let's build a large enough community room that we can maybe use it for other purposes. So when we looked at, go to the next slide, putting all of this stuff together, including some meeting spaces, story time space, and maybe storage for election equipment, we were looking at a building that's roughly 10,000 square feet, which is significantly larger than what the community has now. And it's probably, while we're not trying to sell them short, much bigger than the community is going to be able to support. So when we start looking at some of the space allocations to refine what we're doing, we're looking at the collection size. So in this particular case, there's 12,000 volumes. We want to spread it out a little bit. That's using about 1,200 square feet, which is significant, but it's not the biggest space in the building. So we wanted to build a 100-person multi-purpose room so they could hold elections indoor, or senior meals. That space alone takes up about 1,100 square feet. And then if we added a story time space, that's another 450 square feet. So right there, we're looking at close to 1,600 square feet just for meeting spaces. Now that is much larger than your collection space. So we may want to say, well, do we really need that 100 spaces, or do we need that story time space? Can we combine the story time space into the multi-purpose room and then save, some space that way? Because that's what our community can use, is a good sized room. And then maybe we allow some study space in there. We did make a special allocation for election storage, so all of their stuff can be secure, something that the library can't commingle. It was referenced earlier in the presentation about using the standards to project your collection. If you're in a space, for example, like Centuria, that's 1,400 square feet, and all of a sudden it says your collection should be as twice as large as it is, so it goes up 10,000 volumes. If you were to take 10,000 volumes times $15, that's $150,000 worth of materials that you're going to buy over the course of even 10 years. Is your budget going to support that? Are you going to get increases in funding from your municipality to cover that, or do you have other sources? Again, that's one of those things that you have to check your assumption at the door and see if it's going to make sense. So that is kind of where we get into the next part of things to consider, of really, what are you asking yourself for the library? Some of this is really big picture stuff, as Teresa had mentioned. So you want to go look at how you want to put those spaces together, and that's really what a building program statement does. It gives you a tool to further refine your space. So if you want a staff workroom, but it also is going to double as a break room slash staff getaway space, you're going to configure that differently than is strictly a workspace. So those are the things that you need to convey to other folks, your designers, your architects. But you also have to look at your community and say, okay, we're going to build this library. Our village hall is short space. They don't have meeting space. Does it make sense for us to partner together? Because we both need that big meeting room, but we both don't need it all the time at the same time. So, in this particular project, we did reach out to the village and say, do you want to join us? There was some initial interest, but then the political structure of the communities changed a teeny bit. So they decided they're going to stay where they're at. They did purchase a lot for the library next to their existing building. That 10,000 square feet probably is not going to fit on that space. We're not going to put a second story into a community that can't afford staffing on 2 levels. That doesn't make sense. So then you can use the tool to say, well, if I tweak my collection size, shrink the number of seats we have, and do this to the meeting room, what does that look like for space? So it gives you an opportunity to think about your priorities and what impact they might have on that space. In this case, it clearly shows the need for an addition or a new building. In other cases, you may look at it and say, oh, we're actually in pretty good shape. We just don't have the spaces we need. How can we maybe configure our building differently to fit those spaces? Kind of like Deb did with the drawing she did. She took a space that does have an addition, but she fit their current needs into that footprint and said, yep, we can make this work. So those are some of the things that you need to look at. And this, then you've got a pretty good sense of where you're at. You've got some numbers. You've kind of got that building program statement down in your head. Then you can go to your municipal board and say, we really need to take the next step with this plan. We need to hire an architect to help come up with some options for us. Here's the rationale why we need this. And this is, some of the things we want to do with that plan. And if they, say, yep, that's great, you're good to go with an architect, then you can begin to go beyond this document and look at some different things. So it's really a way you can start thinking about what the impact of a space is. And construction costs have not gotten any cheaper. And so, if we're looking at, a multi-million-dollar investment for a library. So every square foot costs money. So you do want to make sure you have the space you need and it's affordable and cost effective for your community. So you get the opportunity to think about it using this tool without investing dollars. And that's, I think, the beauty of this process for folks. So at this point, we're open for any questions anybody has about this guide or whatever else you want to throw at us, and we'll see if we can answer it.
John, I'm just going to throw in, as you're talking about adjusting as you go, and I've used this tool a lot for libraries who are in the same situation as yours, trying to figure out what do I actually need. And it's always kind of interesting. One of the first things I do is plug in their current stats and, what size their meeting room is now, if they have one, whatever. And the lowest, the extra spaces, the dedicated and the non-assignable, those minimal. And it's always comes out a bit larger than what they're actually in, which just goes to show, it just kind of further emphasizes that these libraries are functioning in a space that's already way too small for what they're doing and what they have. And that's kind of always kind of a good place to start, too, just as kind of a point of reference. It's always interesting.
Yeah, and that's especially true, Deb, with, many of these buildings were constructed before the Americans with Disabilities Act
Yep.
was in place. While we're all supposed to be meeting those guidelines, many libraries don't, because
They can't.
we've put more stuff in that bag should really be holding.
Yep.
And that's a difficult message to convey to folks that don't work in the space every day. And those two sets of numbers would hopefully give them a better understanding of it.
So if anybody has any questions for Teresa, Deb, or John, you can throw those in the chat or the Q&A box. I do not have, oh, I just had one come in. Thank you. So exciting. This is from Alexander. Do you have any recommendations on how to find a good architect? For context, we've considered moving into an existing building, but are not sure whether its floors are adequately strong for books.
So on the South Central Library System page under buildings, I do have a list of architects in Wisconsin and the surrounding states that have specialized in doing libraries, that have experience. And you can go to that page, and it's also linked from our Wisconsin Libraries and Spaces website as well. And those architects have done libraries, which is kind of critical, because if you hire an architect who isn't familiar, then you spend a lot of your time and money educating them on how libraries actually function. So there is a list of architects that you could look at.
And Teresa just dropped those in the chat. Teresa, thank you for having
Thank you.
faster fingers than me. I appreciate that. Let's see, we got a couple other questions, or we have one other question that just came in. This is for Teresa. What doesn't the tool cover that you wish it did? What calculations aren't reducible in complexity?
I think, I think the tool does a pretty good job of covering most things, but I think it's not a magic fix for the planning process. And I think that's what some people find frustrating, is you are going to have to do some work before you can plug the numbers into the spreadsheet. You can't just ask the spreadsheet to do all of the work for you. So, in terms of determining what your service goals are for the future, if you don't have a strategic plan already, it's going to be more difficult to have some of those conversations with your library board about, why do we think we want this meeting room, and where do we pick this number of 100 people in that space? So those kinds of questions are, I think, the trickiest part about using the outline. But overall, I do think it does a pretty good job of at least giving you the opportunity to think through each part of your library in terms of what its space needs are, and then giving you a space at the end to say, look, we know not everything can be shoehorned into one of these categories. Let's just do some dedicated spaces for things that we know we want that maybe not every library has, job pods or maker spaces, or, like I know a library with a recording studio that's just amazing. Not every library needs or wants that. So you really, I think the focus on determining your own library service goals is really key in using this tool. Some of the things that you really can't break down, it's hard to explain to people who aren't familiar with building projects what those non-assignable spaces are, how they come up with those figures. They feel like a stab in the dark. I do believe there's some good justification for why those percentages are what they are in the outline. If you ask me to calculate them, I wouldn't be able to do it for you. So there is a bit of faith that you need to have in terms of where you're going with some of those less visible spaces, like restrooms and elevator shafts and utility or mechanical rooms and things like that.
And to kind of piggyback on what Teresa said, one of the collection areas that is missing in this is that library of things collection. You know, how do you determine where you're going to put that kayak in your library, or that bicycle, or that pair of snowshoes? Those are, you want them on display, but they eat up a whole bunch of space, and certainly much more than a book does. So again, that's, if you intend to have a robust collection, you may need to dedicate different space in that allocation just for your library of things collection.
Yep.
You're muted, Kelly.
Thank you. I'm having a whole conversation with myself over here. Somebody had mentioned that their chat was disabled. So what I will do is also include the link to that list of architects that Deb mentioned in the email that goes out with the recording tomorrow. So that will go out for others who might have missed that list as well. So right now I don't have any other questions. Let me just flip over. Oh, I just have one. Thank you. Thank you. See, as soon as I say that, another one comes in. Do you know if local governments tend to fund new library construction projects or renovations using a referendum, the debt service exemption to the levy limit, or somehow within the typical levy? It seems like there are a few ways to make this happen, but I'm curious whether one tends to go over better with the community.
I'm pausing to see if John wants to jump in on this at all. I think it varies a lot from community to community. I personally have not heard of very many levy limit exemption referendums specifically for library projects. The way the levy limits are structured in Wisconsin, it's a little tricky to do that, primarily because there's not like a guarantee that if you exempt from the levy limit, that it's going to be that, and you tell people it's going to be spent on the library, that it will always be spent on the library. There are many communities that expect the library to do some of the legwork of fundraising for these projects. And in some cases, it is the lion's share of the funding that comes from that fundraising. Not in all cases. There are communities that have taken on debt in order to construct their libraries. So I'm going to pause and see what John has to share, because he has a lot more experience in this.
I think from the referendum perspective, it's library projects or other municipal projects are different than school districts, which go to referendum for their building projects. The referendums that I've seen around library projects have tended to be, yes, I support community X building a new library, or I don't support community X building a new library. It's not a referendum to fund the construction of that project. And those referendums are typically advisory referendums, so that 80% of the people could say yes, and the municipal board could still say no, because it's not a binding referendum. We typically don't do decision making in Wisconsin via a referendum or a direct legislation vote. That's why we have elected officials. Usually a good library project is funded in part by the municipality and some local giving, naming opportunities, things like that, where a group goes out and raises funds for the library. There are very few projects anymore where it's 100% funded by the municipality. It's pretty rare to have happen. There are a few grant opportunities out there. The flexible facilities one was a once in a lifetime event that libraries took advantage of. There is a newer state program that application deadline is the end of this month for local government projects, which will allow up to $2 million, but it's a matching grant, so you have to have money ready readily available for the project, and you need to be shovel ready for that grant application. So if you're not already working with an architect, you're probably going to be behind the 8 ball. I think the debt service is probably the best way to go. The one caveat with debt service is municipalities can only borrow a certain amount of debt, and if they hit that limit, they can't borrow for projects. So if they're already, buying a fire truck, replacing the police station, building in, another public facility, they may already be at their capacity, and they may not have the ability to borrow any additional funding.
Rebecca shared a link, and I also did in chat. That is a link to that local government grants for local projects thing that is ongoing now that John just mentioned. It was a very quickly announced. It was part of the Wisconsin budget bill. It is another one of those, we never know it's coming until it's here, and then it's already practically over kind of situations. Libraries are eligible, but you have to be basically, as John said, shovel ready. So it's, there may be a few of you in that case, but unlikely to be too many libraries that are ready to go and have matching funds already secured.
Okay, let me flip over to the resources slide. As I mentioned, we have the Wisconsin Library Buildings and Spaces page, which will have the recording to this webinar, but you will be sent that as well. And then there are previous webinars, lots of other great resources on that page as well. And then there is also the planning outline, which Teresa talked about. And I will link to that directly also in the email that comes out with the recording so that you have a direct link to that as well. And then here is some contact information for Deb and Teresa and John. I want to thank you all for lending your expertise to this. I think we've learned these are important topics that people need. I don't have any other questions that have come in, and we're almost at time. So I am going to stop the recording, and I want to thank everybody for being here today.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Kelly.